Good afternoon, class. I'm Specialist Brian Vlois, and today I'm going to be going over levels of leadership. This is an unclassified briefing. All information will be unclassified. In the chance of emergency, fire, or active shooter, the meetup location will be directly outside, right next to the gray Honda Civic. The risk level for today is low. The agenda for today is going to be introduction, definition of Army leadership, the levels of leadership and the different styles, educating soldiers, training soldiers, summary, questions, and following that will be the conclusion. Are there any questions so far? Okay. The introduction. The purpose of this briefing is to explain the three foundational leadership styles defined by ADP 6-22 and why it is vital to educate and train soldiers. This brief will be entirely on PowerPoint with visual aids. Leadership. The Army definition pulled directly from ADP 6-22 states, the process of influencing people by providing purpose, direction, and motivation while operating to accomplish the mission and improve the organization. Levels of leadership. There are three primary levels of leadership: direct, organizational, and strategic. The most common form of leadership is direct, as seen illustrated to my left. A direct form of leadership is an E5 instructing an E4. Being in the motor pool and having your senior supervisor direct you to do something. This is the most natural and easy form of leadership. Likewise, this type of leadership often does not have complex instructions. There's an emphasis on developing other soldiers, building up your teammates because you normally work with them, opposed to the other forms of leadership which we will discuss later. Generally, the senior supervisor of this type of leadership understands 2 levels up and 1 level down, basically meaning they understand 2 steps forward of why we're doing this. The next step of leadership is organizational leadership. Exercise leadership through subordinate leaders. Now, instead of just being me telling you what to do, now I am directing you to get your subordinates to do something. This is where you start handing out responsibility. Organizational leaders from ADP 6-22 directly states they establish a climate that supports their subordinate leaders. Organizational leaders form their intentions and their duties off of the commander's intent. Responsibility in leading and synchronizing combined arm operations. Any questions so far? Okay. Strategic leadership is definitely more complex. This is more of a long-term leadership. They guide and integrate multiple organizational levels. So now we're getting into the Army working with the Air Force, working with civilians. This is where there's a more long-term branch, and therefore it gets a lot more complex. These leaders allocate resources, communicate strategic vision, and prepare their commands, the Army itself, for future missions. They adapt directional and organizational forms of leadership to complete their missions. So this is more of a hybrid of organizational and direct. Often, these leaders don't see their ideas come to fruition because they're planning for the long-term scenario. Any questions? So one of the questions is, how do these forms of leadership relate to education and training? They relate pretty importantly. Standards for NCOs are high. I'm sure many of you have heard that the Army is, ever evolving, right? NCOs are the backbone of the Army. It's a very common term, and it's there for a reason. A leader needs to be modular and well-rounded in today's Army. There are multiple threats. There are multiple scenarios that you need to read better than just being blunt about it. There are a lot of situations that you really have to take into consideration critically and tactfully. A lot of this information was pulled from the Army Leader Development Strategy, which is also cited in ADP 6-22. One of the quotes that I thought was very relevant for today's lesson is leader development is achieved through the career-long synthesis of training, education, and experiences. I'm going to get more into that in a few minutes. Foundational growth also lies in education and critical thinking. And now I'm going to get into the meat and potatoes of education and training and why both are vital. We shouldn't choose just one, we should choose both. Now I'm going to get into educating soldiers. Soldiers need education. 18% of enlisted soldiers have accomplished a bachelor's degree or more, compared to 49% of their civilian peers. Building up the Army's junior enlisted requires a strong foundation, and that foundation requires these soldiers to be able to retain and dissect the instructions they do receive. Likewise, education can increase retention and career stability of these soldiers. Knowing your full potential and knowing what you can do on the civilian sector really helps maintain a soldier's dedication to education and to their career. Any questions? Now we're going to go into why training soldiers is so vital, which I really don't think I need to go into, but I'm going to anyways, just to go into some of the occupational, more specific job duties. Soldiers need more occupational training. On average, soldiers receive 20 weeks of occupational training throughout their career. A soldier's career can last from a year, 2 years, 3 years, to a decade or more. That isn't sufficient in today's Army for a lot of these specific jobs where soldiers' lives can depend on how well they perform. Semi-focused retraining occurs weeks or months before a combat deployment. That is not ideal. Like stated earlier, soldiers' lives depend on training, and it is vital for a soldier to be well maintained and ready to go. Home station units need to provide more training opportunities. It is noted that it is very expensive to perform these opportunities, but one cannot put a price on a soldier's life. Going back into the education realm, a well-educated soldier will be able to dissect and retain the emphasis of training that they do receive. That is why it's so important for education and training to be co-efficient. In summary, non-commissioned officers need to understand different foundational levels of leadership so they can apply it to their soldiers and teach it to their soldiers. Likewise, NCOs must understand why education and training are so vital. There are soldiers' lives that depend on this training, and increasing education can enhance the training as well as make sure a soldier has more career potential when they get out of the Army. Here are my references: ADP 6-22, Army Regulation 350-1, the Army Leadership Development Strategy, and 2 civilian sources. Are there any questions? Pending any questions, this is the conclusion of my brief.